Hi, this is Robert Rapier, and this is the first episode of R Squared Energy TV for 2012. Today I want to talk about a topic that is somewhat controversial. I wrote a story on this on the oil drum about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was generated more comments than any story in the history of the oil drum. At that time it was more than 500 comments, and the title was "We Won't Stop Global Warming." And my premise was that the carbon emissions are largely beyond our control in the West. And so I'm going to use a short presentation here to show you why I feel like we really have a difficult problem here that's largely out of our control, and as well as show why the United States catches so much heat over this in the first place. So if you look at the CO2 emissions per person, the United States indeed has very high per capita CO2 emissions. We are more than double the European Union and quite a bit higher than a lot of the developing world. We're not alone up there. I mean, Canada is right there with us. Some of the Middle Eastern countries are right there with us. There are specific countries around the world, especially those that have a lot of fossil fuels, that are very high on the per capita consumption. Our population, though, in the West, in the U.S., is a lot lower than a lot of the developing countries. And so you may not realize it, but if you look at the next slide, our emissions, even ours combined with the European Union, are less than half of that of Asia Pacific. Further, those in Asia Pacific are climbing rapidly, while ours in the United States and the European Union are flat to slightly declining. Now, when you think about why that is, in the United States we use over 20 barrels of oil per person per year. In China they use about 2. In India they use, I think, less than 1. So they are climbing from a very, very low level of fossil fuel consumption, and therefore the barrel that they use, or the 2 barrels they use, are for critical functions like heating their homes or cooking meals. Ours are for things like driving that 12,000th mile a year. So we can cut back a little bit as oil prices go up, but they're not as inclined, and that doesn't hurt them as badly because they need that barrel much more than we need that incremental 23rd barrel or whatever. And so as you've seen, even as oil prices went up, the developing countries, especially Asia Pacific, climbed rapidly, and they pretty soon will be responsible for half of the global CO2 emissions. If you look at the next slide, the change in CO2 emissions for the developed regions of the United States, North America, and the European Union have declined slightly over the past decade, while all of the developing regions have gone up, and in some cases have gone up sharply. So the problem is China is building coal plants. You know, they want to raise their standard of living for their people. India is building refineries. They're using more fossil fuels. All across the world, people are coming up from a very low standard of living, and the number of people it involves is enormous. You know, the population of the United States is 300 million. You know, that's the population of China is well more than 1 billion, and China and India combined have something like 40% of the global population, starting from a very, very low per capita fossil fuel consumption. So the problem is, in the United States, there's relatively little that we can do, even if our emissions went to zero, and if the European Union's emissions went to zero, it would only take us back to like mid-90s levels of global emissions, and they'd be climbing rapidly. So in order to solve this problem, somehow we have got to engage better with the developing countries and convince them that you know, there are other ways to raise standard of living and consume more energy rather than fossil fuels. But if we don't give them some low carbon energy options, the developing world will continue to develop on coal, oil, and natural gas. So to conclude, one thing I'll mention is some people ask me sometimes, what do you think about global warming? I think the science of the greenhouse effect is very clear. I think that burning fossil fuels is clearly putting more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and I think therefore it should be expected that there will be some warming as a result. I think the controversy gets into what exactly the consequences are, how much exactly that warming is. And I get into that a little bit in the book and talk about why there's any controversy at all and why some people have questions. So the position I take in the book is not to try to convince you global warming is real or that it's not real, but rather to explain both sides of the view and why. I think a lot of the people who have questions about global warming are simply dismissed out of hand. And I try to explain why it is that they have questions, and I try to answer some of those questions. So with that, that's this week's episode. Tune in next week.